This is the Capitol Tower, once known as the Pearl Assurance Building, and for many years it has been a landmark in the centre of Cardiff. It was built on an historic site, and somewhere beneath its foundations lie the remains of a gallant Welsh leader. He was a man who stood up against oppression and gained the admiration of those who fought against him. He was brutally killed, but his name lives on.
This is the story of Llywelyn ap Gruffydd ap Rhys, better known today as Llywelyn Bren, or Llewelyn of the Woods. He was born in the mid-1260s into quite comfortable circumstances.
His family held the cantref of Senghennydd and Miskin, a cantref being a way that land was marked out in medieval Wales. He was a great-grandson of the Welsh folk hero Ifor Bach and Nest, granddaughter of Rhys ap Tudor. Llywelyn's father, Gruffydd ap Rhys, had been in conflict with Gilbert de Clare, known as Gilbert the Red, the Lord of Glamorgan and 7th Earl of Gloucester. Land conflicts were a common occurrence as the normal English steadily nibbled away at the lands of the Welsh. The key part of Llywelyn's story begins in the early 1300s. Life in Wales at that time was extremely hard for most people. Within a few years, it was to get a lot harder, with a toxic mixture of famine, oppression, and violence.
Llywelyn appears to have got on well with Gilbert's son, also called Gilbert, who succeeded his father to become the 8th Earl of Gloucester. It's even possible that Llywelyn worked for him, perhaps as an advisor. It's evident that Llywelyn was well educated and was cultured, and a chronicle of the time described him as a great man and powerful in his own country.
But this Gilbert was killed, along with several hundred Glamorgan men, at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. He had no children, and so a complicated inheritance dispute began, involving his 3 sisters and a very avaricious brother-in-law. He was Hugh le Despencer the Younger.
In 1315 came events that were to lead to a major uprising.
Exceptionally wet and cold weather throughout northern Europe caused harvest failures. It was the beginning of the Great Famine, which was to last several years. Food became scarce and expensive. The poorest began to starve to death.
These were truly desperate times, but there was no let-up in the demand for tithes and taxes to fund the government of King Edward II. At this time, the Glamorgan lands were in the temporary custody of the Crown, and the King appointed a new administrator for them. He was Payne de Turberville of Coity Castle near Bridgend. Payne de Turberville seems to have been well named, because pain is what he inflicted on the starving and destitute people in Glamorgan at that time. And it's quite likely that his harshness was largely designed to line his own pockets.
There isn't much information about the effects of the famine in Wales, but it must have been similar to England, where it's estimated that at least 1 in 10 people died of starvation. Desperate people ate grass, roots they dug up, dogs, cats, rats, and there was even cannibalism.
Llewelyn saw the great suffering and denounced the cruelty of de Turberville to the king. But of course de Turberville was the king's representative, and he in turn denounced Llewelyn to the king for sedition, that is, treason. The king responded by demanding that Llewelyn appear before him at Lincoln to answer to the charge, and he gave him the very forthright message that if he was found guilty, he would be hanged.
The mood in Wales at that time was desperate, angry and ripe for an uprising. Llewelyn had no trouble raising a force said to be of 10,000 men. Then, in late January 1316, he launched a surprise attack on Caerphilly Castle, which had been built by Gilbert the Red. This was an ambitious move, to say the least. It is a huge castle with formidable defences, and although he took the outer ward, the defences beyond were too strong, and so a siege began. People were killed, and Caerphilly town was burned. News of this attack spread and sparked action in other parts of South Wales. Kenfig and Llantrisant castles were captured. Other towns and castles in Glamorgan were attacked. The king wanted the uprising to be crushed quickly. The task was given to Humphrey de Bohun, the 4th Earl of Hereford and Lord of Brecon. He raised 2 forces with the backing of other marcher lords, including Roger Mortimer, the 1st Earl of March, a very powerful marcher lord.
One force encountered Llewelyn's men just south of Caerphilly at Morgraig Castle, of which little remains today. It's possible that Llewelyn had few trained soldiers with him. He certainly got the worst of the encounter and he fled north. What perhaps he didn't know at that moment was that a second force was heading south towards him from Brecon.
When Llewelyn realised what was happening and that he faced much stronger forces, he knew that he had no hope of success. He wanted to save the lives of his men. He told them that they must surrender, but that he would ask that he alone would be punished. He duly surrendered at Ystrad Fellter on the 18th of March 1316. It was said that de Bohun and Mortimer were greatly impressed by the gallantry of his request. Llewelyn was taken away and imprisoned in the Tower of London. The marcher lords urged the king to grant him a pardon.
And then the story took a sinister turn. Somehow Llewelyn fell into the hands of the king's favourite, Hugh le Despencer the Younger, a very avaricious and utterly ruthless person. Hugh was at the centre of the Glamorgan inheritance dispute. He had married one of the sisters of the dead Gilbert and had manoeuvred to take control of just about all of the Glamorgan lands. This caused a rift with the other sisters and their husbands, including Roger Mortimer.
Hugh brought Llewelyn back from London to his Cardiff castle. Without a trial, and presumably being confident that he did not need the king's permission, he subjected Llewelyn to the horrific execution of being hanged, drawn and quartered within the grounds of the castle. He was aged about 50, and, of course, Hugh seized Llewelyn's lands.
After his execution, Llewelyn's body parts were put on display in various places. This was quite commonplace. It was a warning for others not to think about behaving similarly. But afterwards they were returned to Cardiff and were buried at Greyfriars, a Franciscan friary that dated from the 12th century.
That building has long gone. The remains of a later mansion house built on the site were demolished to make way for the Capitol Tower. And so today the remains of Llywelyn Bren, a gallant Welsh rebel, lie here beneath this tall tower in the city centre. And there is a postscript to the story of Llywelyn Bren. A complicated power battle ebbed and flowed, but eventually a successful rebellion led by the king's wife, Queen Isabella, and her presumed lover, Roger Mortimer, led to the overthrow of King Edward and the arrest of the hated Hugh. They had fled to Glamorgan, aiming to raise a force, but there was no help for them there. They were captured, and it is generally assumed that Edward was probably later murdered. As for Hugh, his murder of Llewelyn was one of the many charges brought against him, and he was, of course, found guilty. Hugh was hanged, drawn and quartered, experiencing exactly the gruesome end that he had inflicted on Llewelyn. Payne de Turberville had already been replaced as the king's administrator in Glamorgan.
But there is something of a happy ending to this tragic tale. After Llewelyn died, his widow Llechi and their 7 sons had a turbulent time. They were at first protected and they were occasionally imprisoned. But in 1327, the family lands in Senghenydd were returned to them, and Llechi received an allowance from the earldom of Hereford until she died in 1349.